I want to show you how I color grade my drone footage and a few things that you can do to give yourself the best possible starting point when you're color grading shots from your Mini 3 Pro. So I have two different clips here. Both of them were shot in downtown. The first one was shot during the day, the sun behind me. The building's lit from the front and the sky is like a nice deep blue color. The second clip is the exact opposite. I shot it at sunset. The sun is behind the building, so the buildings are being lit from behind. And I wanted to show how it doesn't matter whether you shoot during the day or at night, the effects, the color correcting, the color grading that we're going to be doing to these clips, it's essentially the same for both of them. And this works no matter where you're filming. It doesn't have to be in a city. You could be filming in the mountains or in the forest. It doesn't really matter. Wherever you're flying your drone, these effects are going to work the same no matter what kind of clips they are. And I'm going to show you how it works at night and how it works during the day, because these two shots are very different in the way that they're lit, but they're not so different in the way that we're going to color correct them. And before we start color correcting or color grading, I want to briefly talk about how we got these shots to where they are, how they were exposed, what kind of settings they were shot in on the drone. And one thing I want to point out is I've got the waveform pulled up, and on the daytime shot and the nighttime shot, you can see here that nothing is overexposed. We got some light here that's really close to the top, but it's clearly not overexposed. Same with shooting at night. Even though we're shooting into the sun, nothing is overexposed. The brightest point is right here, and it is below the line that would be an overexposed shot. And this is really important later when we start to try to find some of these details in the sky, some of the clouds and the colors in the sky. How'd we overexpose the shot, exposing, say, for the buildings instead of the sky? We might have gotten something where the sky was no longer usable. So I want to show you real quick. If we're setting up this shot, for the daytime shot with the sun behind me, I expose for the buildings. So this brightest point here on the waveform is actually these two buildings here. They've got really white tops to them. And I could see on my controller for the drone when they became overexposed, and I just clicked it down just a couple stops lower to make sure that nothing was going to be overexposed. But the good thing is, because the sky is a little bit darker because the sun was behind me, all the buildings and everything in the foreground is right here sort of in the middle of the waveform, which is a really nice place to have everything. Now, in the nighttime shot, we don't have the luxury of getting to expose for the building. I had to expose for the sky. So what I did was I basically brought the exposure to where the sky was blown out, and then I stopped it down a couple stops again. And you can tell it's a little ways away from the top, giving me plenty of room for my color grading, and I won't lose any of the detail of the sky. But what that does is the buildings are a little bit darker. So if you look at the daytime shot and the nighttime shot, the buildings, the subject in the foreground, in the daytime shot, it's right here about 512. In the nighttime shot, they're all the way down here at the bottom. So there's a temptation to expose for the building. Bring the building up, the building in the foreground up until they're, middle exposed here around 512. Technically, yes, the buildings look a lot closer in these two. Even if you're shooting for specifically the building, you might be tempted to expose more towards the middle for your subjects. But what happens is the background is completely blown out. So now when we go in here and let's say that we start to color grade our footage and we decide, let's try to pull back some of the sky, it's a little too blown out. If I try to pull this sky back, it's gone. There is no information. You can see here on the waveform, there's nothing left. We can pull this down as much as we want. The sky will turn gray, but we're not going to get back any of the details of the clouds or the colors of the sky, where if we did not overexpose, all the detail of the sky can still be there. In our color grading, we can pull back as much detail as we want. And this is a good time also to say that if you don't have an ND filter, you need to buy one. You can find them on Amazon or eBay or wherever. It's going to help, especially for these daytime shots. You should aim for your shutter speed to be about double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, you should shoot for 1/50 as a shutter speed. If you're filming at 60 frames a second, you should look for 1/120 as a shutter speed. It's going to give you the most cinematic footage. You won't have kind of the choppy look to your clip, and it's going to give you a little bit of motion blur. But with the Mini 3 Pro, it has an aperture of 1.7, so it's really difficult during a nice bright day shot like this to get anywhere near the right shutter speed without an ND filter. For this shot, I was using an ND32, which is a pretty strong filter, but with a 1.7 aperture on a bright sunny day, you need that strong of an ND filter to get anywhere close to 1/50 as a shutter speed because I was filming this in 24 frames a second. So it's really important to get your exposure correct before you start the process that I'm going to show you. The second important thing to note here is that I shot both of these clips using the D-Cine Like mode on the Mini 3 Pro. That is going to give me a little more dynamic range and a flatter color profile so that I can add the colors I want to in post. It's also going to give you the 10-bit color, so you won't have the issues of banding and things like that in maybe some of the gradients of the sky. And it's also just going to give you more colors to choose from when you start to pull colors back in your post-processing. So all of that being said, now let's look at the color correcting process on these two clips. So because we shot this in the flat profile of the D-Cine Like, the first thing we're gonna do is add the contrast and saturation to get this clip looking a little more natural. Now there's a couple different ways to do this depending on what program you're using. One way is to use the curves and to pull the blacks down and the highlights up until you get a nice balance of light and color here on your waveform. And you can boost your saturation. And this is a good way to get started with the color correcting process of these clips. What I have done is I created a LUT that is a D-Cine Like conversion LUT. So it's going to take your D-Cine Like footage and do basically what I just did to it, add some contrast, add some color to it. And if we just drag and drop that on this node, we get a nice balance of contrast, a nice boost in color, and it's just a little bit quicker of a way to get started color correcting and color grading if you shoot in the D-Cine Like on the Mini 3 Pro. One important thing to notice here on the LUT that I created is, although it does add a lot of contrast, the blacks still do not hit 0 and the whites are still not overexposed. So it's still going to retain all the details in the shadows and the highlights of your image. It's just going to give you more contrast and more color. And I want to show you how this LUT also works on a darker shot scene like the one that I shot at night. I can just drag and drop this D-Cine Like conversion LUT, and it adds saturation and contrast to the image without overexposing the highlights or crushing the blacks. And I have where you can download this D-Cine Like conversion LUT for free. All you have to do is click the link in the show notes below. So I want to show you how I would go about color correcting and color grading these shots. So when I'm working with city images like this, a lot of times the buildings are a little bit dingy and they kind of give off a more yellow look than what I want. And so I go in here to my qualifier and my eyedropper. I'm just gonna select a part of the building here. I'm gonna hit Shift H so that you can only see what it is that I'm working on. And I can do a little bit of tweaking to the color here because I only want to work with just the yellow part of the building. So I'm gonna play around with a couple of these slides until I get as much of the building as what I want. So once I have the portion that I want selected, I'm just gonna take the saturation all the way down to 0, hit Shift H again to show the whole image, and just show you what I've done here by turning this node on and off. So here's the full color, and here is with the yellows taken out. So it's done a little bit too much. It's affected a little bit too much of the reds, and it doesn't need to be pulled down this far. So I'm gonna bump this back maybe to 20 and turn that on and off. Okay, so this is about where I want this for this image. I've taken some of the dinginess out of the building, and to me, this is a better place to start with. So I'm gonna create a new node, and one other thing that I like to do is a lot of time in the sky, the blue is a little bit too bright. So I'm just going to do the same thing and pull a little bit of the blues out. So I drop that to about 30%, and here's with the blue full, and here's with it pulled back a little bit. So this does look a little bit too desaturated, but when I start color grading this clip, I can add some global saturation to the entire image, and it will keep this blue from being a little bit too vibrant. So now to start color grading, I'm gonna look through my Mini 3 Pro LUT pack and maybe try out a couple of these. I like Money Shot. So this is where you can play around with your footage, add a lot of different effects to it, and just depending on what kind of look you're going for, this is where you can really be creative and make any kind of look that you want to go for on this shot. But the important thing to know is that when we start color grading with LUTs or with color wheels or however you choose to do it, Because we exposed the shot correctly and did some basic color corrections, we're free to do really whatever we want to with the shot, and we haven't ruined the image by blowing out the highlights or by losing all the information in the darks. So now let's look at the sunset shot. So I will do this again. I'm gonna add my D-Cine Like conversion LUT to get us started. We haven't blown out the highlights and we haven't lost any details in the darks. And there's a little bit of color correction that needs to be done before we start color grading. The first thing is the white balance I think was a little bit off. It was a little too cool for this shot. So I'm going to warm up and add a little bit of tint and try to get these colors back a little more natural. So the white balance is where I want it, but there's still a lot of blue in this image. So I'm just gonna go in here and remove a lot of this blue. So I'm gonna drop the saturation all the way down to 0, and then I'm just gonna go into my output here, drop it to 0, and slowly slide it up until the blues are as desaturated as what I want. So let me just turn off the color correction that I've added after the LUT. And here it is straight out of camera with the conversion LUT, and here it is with the white balance adjusted and some of the blues taken out. There's also some green in this shot that I don't like, so I'm going to do the same thing here. Find this green and take it out. Okay, and I can do the same thing going here to my output, put it to 0, and just slowly pull it up until the greens are as desaturated as what I want them. So here are these 3 corrections that I've added to the clip. And now I'm going to start, that was somewhat color correcting, somewhat color grading, trying to kind of get the look that I want. But now I'm going to start kind of the official color grading of the process. And one thing that I want to do is I want to accentuate the sunset and some of the warm tones here. So I'm just going to grab the color dropper tool, find some of these oranges, the oranges and reds. I'm just going to boost those. Okay, so I upped the saturation to 100%. Now let me turn that on and off. Here's off, and here's with the color correction on. It's just gonna give us some more saturation in the warms, the sunset, and the lights on the buildings. And if that's too much, we can always come in here to the output and drop that to, let's say, 60%. So again, here's all the changes we've made so far. Okay. So now I'm gonna add a LUT to this for the color grading. I'm gonna go with money shot and I'm gonna drop it to about 50% of its max. And from here, you can do as much or as little color grading as you want to for the type of look you want out of your shot. You can really be creative. You can mess with the curves. You can mess with the color wheels. You can add LUTs to it. And because of the way we exposed this shot in the camera, we retained all the detail in the sky. You might be tempted to expose a little bit darker because you don't want the buildings this bright. But knowing that in post, we're going to be pulling the blacks down, it's actually really nice to shoot this in a way where the darks are a little bit brighter. But as we pull the blacks and the shadows down, we know that we're not gonna have any noise in the dark portions of this footage. So even if we zoom in quite a bit, the dark parts of this footage, there's no noise at all because we started with the exposure on the high side, but then we pulled the blacks and the shadows down, and now we have a really clean image as a final product. And I hope that I have stressed enough the importance of exposing your shot correctly to make sure that your highlights are not blown out. You want to make sure that your blacks and your shadows are not too dark, so you still have some room to pull them down. And if you expose your shot correctly, you're giving yourself the best possible starting point for getting the desired outcome when you're finished with your post-processing. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and check out the show notes below. I've got a link where you can download my D-Cine Like conversion LUT for free. It'll help make your color grading process just a little bit easier. So thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you next time.